Hello everyone, and welcome to this audio podcast in this new series on the LabTronix series. This is a part of the Ballistix Edition, and today I'm going to be giving an overview around nutrition and renal health in context of the evidence base. And this is a storm Ballistix production in collaboration with the RPSG and KDARS. So this is it's a RPSG and KDARS collaborative, once again, this is the Shientist. So to begin with, I thought I'd provide an overview of nutrition in renal disease and kidney disease in context of an introduction. So introduction of sort of renal-friendly nutrition may be helpful to protect kidneys from damage. And there's some work by Aris and team in 2017 that highlight some of the perspective around this. The adaptation of healthy nutrition may slow down damage to the afferent and efferent arterioles in context of the glomerular filtration rate in early chronic kidney disease or CKD stages. In line with this, patients with renal disease have been in literature at least. There's context to highlight that suspect or high risk patients with CKD should limit the intake of particular types of types of foods. And in the next few sort of slides around this, I'm going to highlight some context in that regard. And at the end of each slide here, you can see a few sort of list of sort of citations where once going through the slide set, you can look to access those papers through particular databases and search engines. So healthy diet or healthy nutrition as in context of protection against the incidence of chronic kidney disease. So in this regard, healthy nutrition patterns also include approaches like that who follow, for example, the Mediterranean diet or a dietary approach to stop stop high blood pressure. For example, there's works by Batch and team in 2019 which look at DASH, which is an abbreviation for dietary approach to prevent hypertension, and also vegetarian diets. Healthy nutrition pattern can also include sort of higher consumption of whole grains, some fruits, not all fruits, some vegetables, and in particular healthy carbohydrates. Intake of fiber, for example, vitamin C and vitamin E and carotenoids can be helpful. Lower consumption of saturated fats, salt, and processed foods would be important. Lower dietary acid load is also has been documented as advantageous. Healthy nutrition may also play a protective role in primary, again in sort of primary symptoms, signs and symptoms that link to CKD. And there was a study in 2019 that investigated that that investigated adhering to healthy nutrition can reduce the odds on the incidence around albuminuria, and particularly in context of particular types of or forms of chronic kidney disease. And there's works by Batch and team in 2019 that highlight this. So, in context of unhealthy nutrition, it may be, for example, that which is traditionally part of traditionally that has been linked to westernized diets or nutrition, and where there can be high fat, or high carbohydrates and meat, and particularly where in some meats, in meat diets, where, for example, there can be alongside with the meat, with meat there can be a carbohydrate load as well, and some diets are high, where they are high in refined starches, saturated fats and trans fatty acids, and sodium, or in context of salt, and lower in whole grains, lower in whole grains, fruit, vegetables, omega-3 and fatty acids and fiber can also constituent as in the case of contributory to a unhealthy diet or nutrition as well. And there's also evidence to highlight that certain diets can heighten the inflammatory response. So there can be an increase in particular inflammatory markers, and and certain aspects wherein, from a laboratory perspective, can trigger for example, the use of particular biomarkers to detect CKD, chronic kidney disease, owing to the kinds of parameters that may be as part of those who may have may be in suspect or high risk in chronic kidney disease, owing to the the parameters in context of their nutritional intake versus how, for example, the renal function is as well. So certain biomarkers can be used to detect renal insufficiency in some context a little bit quicker, but at the same time, some of these biomarkers are not routinely used or prompted in laboratory or pathology practices. Generally, the biomarkers in this context are used or implemented based on general population as well. So in context of some further context or understanding around the evidence base, is that dietary pattern rich in whole grains, again vegetables, fruits, certain fruits, legumes, fish, and lower intake of red and processed meats, sodium, sugar, and sweetened beverages that are associated with reduced incidence of suspect and high risk chronic kidney disease and albuminuria have been documented in works by Batch and team in 2019 to highlight that a link between certain food types and categories, a sort of a good versus a bad in the works by Batch and team in 2019, again Mediterranean diet and glycemic control have a positive can have a positive association on aspects of surrounding, for example, weight loss and reducing reducing cardiovascular risk. A plant-based Mediterranean diet or nutrition patterns have also inversely been associated with microalbuminuria, and again Batch and team look at that in a bit more detail. There's works again where it has been highlighted that the DASH approach has shown some significant reduction in aspects of systolic and diastolic blood pressure or arterial blood pressure, and reduction in the incidence of cardiovascular disease, stroke, and heart failure, and adherence to particular nutrition, again where it's rich in particular fruits, again not all fruits and vegetables, can help reduce the risk of doubling or almost reduce the risk almost by double in context of the serum creatinine increase, and in leading to end stage chronic kidney disease or end stage renal disease. Adherence again to particular nutrition, again around fruit and vegetables, can ultimately be quite effective. Some context in relating to sort of salt restriction in renal diseases. A high intake of dietary sodium can be an important factor influencing arterial blood pressure, and salt restricted diets or nutrition is associated with less probability of proteinuria, and also renal scarring, also known as glomerular sclerosis. And there's works by Riss and team in 2017 that look into this as well. High sodium intake induces sort of an overactivity or hyperfiltration, which can cause renal damage as far as glomerular function is concerned. There has been some work by Clegg and Hill Gallant in 2019 where it said that the US Department of Health and Human Services and the National Kidney Foundation had recommended sort of plant-based diets, and the premise around this is that there's lower in sulfur containing amino acids, high plant-based nutrition is higher, can be higher in fiber, and they can be low in saturated fat, and contain plant-based nutrition can contain sources of potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, and calcium. However, that being said, potassium generally in any sort of nutrition plan it needs to be sort of leveled out, because generally potassium can cause problem can be a sort of a contraindication in some regards, with regard to different aspects of physiology, and also where a plant in context of a plant-based diet or nutrition can have low levels of sodium as well. Health some advantages of a plant-based diet also include that there's can include a preventing of cardiovascular risk and hypertension or high blood pressure, and also delaying the progression of kidney disease or chronic kidney disease. Again, retrospective data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination and Nutrition Examination Survey shows that consumption of sort of meat-based diets can put patients in a higher risk category in context of progression to end-stage renal disease, and in particular where there's blood remnant or a red meat, that in literature there has been documented by Clegg and Hill-Gallant in 2019. However, in some meat-based diets where for example the meat the blood or any blood remnant in any meat is completely drained, then that in context of nutritional health would be absolutely fine. Also, the same data, some data shows that a higher ratio of plant to total protein has been associated with a lower risk of mortality. Plant-based diets are associated with around 12% lower risk of decline in estimated glomerular filtration rate compared with whole-based meat-based nutrition or diets. Consumption of fruits and vegetables may be associated with greater benefits in kidney function, but again, in context of fruits, generally, like other sort of food types, foodstuffs that can be consumed. Generally, not all fruits are as safe as in the case, for example, versus vegetables. A vegan diet has been associated with, for example, delaying suspect or high-risk individuals for going into hemodialysis or a form of renal replacement therapy. And there was a cohort study of patients with an estimated glomerular filtration rate of in and around 5 to 7 mils per min, which is in context of category falls in the category of CKD stage 5 or beyond, and where dialysis or hemodialysis was delayed or had been delayed for about a year, and patients in this context were not at increased risk of death or hospitalization owing to the particular kind of nutrition that they were the nutrition that they were that had been highlighted that would be useful for them. So there's works by Clegg and Hill-Gallant again in 2019 that sort of look into this. A bit more about sort of plant-based diets now. phosphorus from plant sources is less well absorbed than phosphorus from animal sources, and individuals and patients with chronic kidney disease are recommended to reduce, for example, potassium intake, anything from 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams per D, and basically the reason being is potassium, as I'm sure many will know, have an effect on the cardiovascular system, and patients with CKD are recommended to avoid high potassium and plant-based foods such as seeds, nuts, beans, peas, as well as fruits and vegetables. So in this context, potassium derived from plants may promote intracellular potassium distribution, and promote fecal excretion of potassium due to natural fibers that are based in plant-based diets, or plant-based nutrition. There was an investigation or study that took place in 2016 that investigated that, although no studies really have indicated or highlighted a difference in, for example, serum potassium levels in patients consuming plant-based versus meat-based potassium sources. There is some evidence to highlight that at the same time, the potassium content in plant-based nutrition can be more advantageous to an extent versus other categories of nutrition. I'm going to talk a little bit now about a protein or high protein diet in context of chronic kidney disease. Now, generally, the renal system or renal physiology plays a crucial role in amino acid and protein metabolism, including breakdown and excretion of protein metabolites. High protein nutrition may cause damage to the kidney and may lead to accumulation of toxic protein metabolites. High protein nutrition has been, at least in literature, and works by Coe and team in 2017, have highlighted that any protein intake that's more than 1.2 grams of dietary protein per kilogram of body weight per day can induce significant alterations in renal function and renal health. And high protein high protein nutrition can modulate a renal hemodynamic aspects, where by increasing the renal blood flow and elevating the intraglomerular pressure, leading to higher glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, and it makes generally in this context a high protein diet can make the renal system, the renal function work harder, and in addition to this, a high protein diet nutrition can also be associated with glomerular hyperfiltration, and increase the urinary albumin excretion as well. The impact of protein consumption on the risk of end-stage renal disease may depend on the type of protein source, and this is important because in some renal diseases specifically, generally, when I say renal diseases, whilst there are several forms of renal diseases, renal diseases, generally the overarching sort of theme around renal diseases is, for example, chronic kidney disease. But whilst there are different forms, there are several forms of renal diseases. For example, focal segmental glomerular sclerosis, or IgA nephropathy, and SLE, or systemic lupus erythematosus, etc. These forms of renal diseases or chronic kidney diseases have a basis where from the point of diagnosis, they are linked to protein leaking as a preempt. And so in such particular diseases or forms of chronic kidney disease, again, the impact of protein consumption on the risk of end-stage renal disease may depend on the type, again, the type of protein sources, specifically, again, where red meat can cause more problems in this regard for those who consume sort of protein in red meat based protein in those in and around where individuals may be suspect or high risk for those particular forms of chronic kidney disease. Sulfur containing amino acids induce higher acid load, and end products from animal protein may exert detrimental effects on renal function. And again, works by Co and team in 2017 look into the protein aspects of nutrition. In context of low protein diet, so low protein diet offers a variety of benefits, advantages with in context of renal function, renal function, and also in context of renal insufficiency. So low protein diet, low protein nutrition reduces nitrogen waste products and decreases renal workload by lowering intraglomerular pressure, which may protect the kidneys. At the same time, protein restriction has been demonstrated to lower proteinuria by around between 20 to 50% in patients who are suspect or high risk for chronic kidney disease. And again, I say this quite loosely because again, in particular forms of renal disease, again, those that I have mentioned, generally where the diagnosis is linked to protein leaking, protein restriction in particular forms of renal disease can be advantageous in that regard. However, at the same time, a low protein diet, low protein nutrition can prevent uremic symptoms as well, and effectively delay the initiation of those individuals or patients being worked up for forms of renal replacement therapy as well. Now, I'm going to highlight a few things in context of challenges of adherence, to a low protein diet. Now, successful adherence is hardly predictable and generally requires patients who are suspect or high risk for chronic kidney disease chronic kidney disease or end-stage renal disease to have the sort of the knowledge and attitude, and also forms of support in context of knowing how to sort of navigate certain aspects of nutritional health, nutrients, nutrition, and also in context of knowing the sort of constituent aspects of nutrition as well. So a good patient or a good patient physician sort of communication, self-monitoring of protein intake, and periodic sort of feedback by where patients have get context from, for example, nutritionists, or dietitians can improve the recognition around nutritional health and its importance. And low protein diet requires frequent periodic follow-up visits. So, for example, every where suspect or high-risk patients may have follow-ups 3 to 4 months for monitoring nutritional intake and nutritional status, and can and should be evaluated by investigating, for example, BUN in context of blood urea nitrogen appearance in a 24 for example, in a 24-hour urine specimen. Although, having said that, 24 urine specimens and collections are not as routine in sort of nephrology practices as they once were, but in certain populations. So, for example, in pediatrics and young people versus the old adult population or older population, 24-hour urine collections can still be quite useful. And there's works again by Coe and team in 2017 that look into that. Protein intake in context of those who are already on a form of renal replacement therapy, for example, peritoneal dialysis or hemodialysis. So guidelines retrospectively have recommended that a much higher protein intake in CKD stage 5 patients are treated with dialysis than in pre-dialysis CKD patients, and lower dietary protein and nutrition intake is associated with a higher morbidity, hospitalization, and mortality in context of those who are on forms of hemodialysis. Patients treated with dialysis or hemodialysis should be approached to sort of adopt a sort of a more balanced form in context of nutrition, but in line with this, generally at the same time, low LPD or low protein diet for individuals on forms of renal replacement therapy has to be sort of viewed quite loosely, because protein is generally required for repair as well, and since dialysis or forms of renal replacement therapy generally require generally can cause sort of a detriment to hemostasis and from physiological perspective as well. Generally speaking, patients on forms of renal replacement therapy should not be worn off completely from not consuming protein at all. For example, protein is required for repair, and in certain food types, for example, in certain meats, and in chicken or poultry, for example. Generally speaking, the food types have property where they can help in actually repairing certain cells that are required as part of the general physiology. I just want to say a few acknowledgements for this work in regards to this slide set. Acknowledgement to or Chalkowska who composed this, developed the who co-developed this slide set in collaboration with an academic institution and the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG, and also to Christine, who was involved from the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG, and the Kidney Disease and Renal Support Group, or KDOS, for kids. Thank you to both of those colleagues who helped co-develop this work.